Our daily Bible reading today comes from Amos chapter 1 through chapter 3. And our daily devotional today here at Carrollton Christian Fellowship comes from the beginning of Amos chapter 1. With our devotional today, we see Amos the man and we see the message of Amos. Verse 1, we see Amos the man. By studying and getting a good survey of Scripture and of the text, we see that Amos is not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. He's not mentioned anywhere else. And it seems that Amos has no formal theological or prophetic training. He has no training. He has no training in how to be a prophet, in ministry. He has absolutely no training. But instead, he was a sheep herder. He was a tender of the sheep, and that's the only place he ever spent time in. And what we see here is that we see that the calling of the Lord is enough. The calling of the Lord and the Lord's calling and the word of the Lord is enough to equip the individual. So we need to be careful not to put additional pressures and steps that maybe perhaps the Lord has not called an individual to go into. Because if you do, you are actually stating and qualifying that Amos is not a valid prophet. So be careful of that. Many denominations would tell you by their practices and by their checklist that Amos is not a valid practice by the way they conduct ministry. So we need to be very careful of that. We need to be careful telling people they have to do something in order to be used by the Lord that the Lord has not told them to do. Be careful of that. The Lord is the one who calls, who equips, and who sends out and who gives instruction. We know from 1 Kings chapter 20, 2 Kings chapter 2, and 2 Kings chapter 4, we know 4 places there that at this time when Amos's ministry was, we know that there was a school of prophets, but yet Amos didn't go there. But yet Amos was still called and used mightily for the Lord's work and by the Lord. Amos was a simple man. Amos was a farmer, and he was called to ministry. Amos's calling we see in chapter 7, verses 14 through 15. And we see that Amos was primarily a prophet to Israel during the days of Uzziah, who was in the south, but of the northern kingdom there, Jeroboam. And then in verse 2, we see the message of Amos. We see that what Amos says with the word roar. So the message of Amos was one of roaring. It was a message of judgment. And this judgment, this primary judgment, we see in chapters 1 through 2. We also see that Amos's message was one that was from Jerusalem. This was one from God's perspective, coming from Jerusalem and speaking to Israel, to the northern tribes, to Samaria. And this was speaking about and towards the nation there, Israel, how they were being and living in complete and direct disobedience of setting up places of worship, rival places of worship other than where God had said, this is where worship will go. They started adopting cultures. They started adopting local traditions in order for where to worship the Lord instead of where the Lord said to worship him. So we need to be careful for that in our days. We need to be careful that we do not start adopting local traditions, local customs, and things on how and where and when and why to worship the Lord. But instead, we look to the word of the Lord and instruction from the Lord on how to do that in our present situations where we may be. So I hope that this may be a good encouragement to us, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So take care, have a blessed one, and we'll see you then.